This is Duke University.
Good evening. May welcome you here tonight for our conversation on civility and difference. I'm Noah Pickus, Associate Provost here at Duke University. And on behalf of the Morris B. Abram Distinguished Residency Committee, I am pleased to welcome you to this entire evening. It's one of a series of events that this week that are associated with the Abram Residency, and it's co-sponsored by a variety of organizations here at Duke. These include the Religions and Public Life Initiative of the Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Duke Center for Jewish Studies, the Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Center for Ethics, Public Policy, and the Professions, the Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke Student Affairs, and the Center for Civic Engagement. The Morris B. Abram Distinguished Residency was made possible by a gift to Duke from the Abram family in honor of the late civil rights activist, attorney, and president of Brandeis University. Among his career contributions, Morris Abram served as U.S. representative to the UN Commission on Human Rights and founded UN Watch, a non-governmental organization that monitors UN performance. He also helped draft the Fourth Geneva Convention, which established international law with regard to protecting civilians in war zones. He worked for 14 years to overturn a Georgia election rule that gave less weight to votes cast by urban Black voters and pursued other legal changes in his home state to protect civil rights activists. The Abram family is here tonight, and we would like to thank them and welcome them.
Yeah.
I want to now turn the podium over to Professor Laura Lieber, Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, who will introduce the program and the panel.
Thank you all. It's my pleasure to be here after months of anticipation. And on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies, it's really terrific to look out and see such a crowd for such a worthy and inspiring event. I'm going to just go right into introducing our two panelists and our moderator so that we can have as much time as possible for the conversation. No soul was ever saved by hate. No truth ever proved by violence. No redemption was ever brought about by a holy war. Now is the time for Jews, Christians, and Muslims to say what they have failed to say in the past. We are all children of Abraham. And whether we are Isaac or Ishmael, Jacob or Esau, Leah or Rachel, Joseph or his brothers, we are precious in the sight of God. We are blessed, and to be blessed, no one has to be cursed. God's love does not work that way. So writes international religious leader, philosopher, award-winning author, and deeply respected moral voice, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, in the final pages of his most recent book, Not in God's Name. Described by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales as a light unto this nation, and by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as an intellectual giant, we are deeply honored that Rabbi Sacks is our distinguished guest this evening. Since stepping down as the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth, a position he served for 22 years, Rabbi Sacks has held a number of professorships at several academic institutions. He currently serves as the Ingeborg and Ira Renner Global Distinguished Professor at NYU. Rabbi Sacks has been awarded 17 honorary doctorates, and in 2016 he received the Templeton Prize in recognition of his powerful moral voice in the world and his affirmation that religion need not, indeed must not, be alienated from the public square. He is the author of over 24 beloved books, including To Heal a Fractured World, The Dignity of Difference, and most recently, Not in God's Name. He is an articulate spokesman for the value of true and robust pluralism, a thoroughly modern voice rooted firmly in classical Jewish sources. Conversing with him will be Imam Abdullah Antepli. Imam Antepli, a treasured colleague, is Chief Representative of Muslim Affairs at Duke University and Senior Fellow at the Duke Office of Civic Engagement. He completed his initial religious training and education in his native Turkey, but we at Duke are so lucky that he has made his home here. A pioneer in advocating for robust and organic presence of Muslims on college campuses, among other locations, Imam Antepli is the founder and executive board member of the Association of College Muslim Chaplains and a board member of the Association for College and University Religious Affairs. He came to Duke as our first Muslim chaplain in 2008, the same year I arrived, so I have never known Duke without him. And through his current work here, Imam Antepli engages students, faculty, and staff across and beyond campus through seminars, panels, and other avenues. He works tirelessly, and I do mean tirelessly as what others find wearying seems to energize him, to bring Muslim voices and perspectives to the discussions of faith, spirituality, social justice, and more. Imam Antepli also serves as a faculty member in the Duke Divinity School, teaching a variety of courses on Islam and Muslim traditions and cultures, and he's a pioneering figure in interreligious dialogue for reasons that will soon become self-evident, including his kindness, humor, integrity, passion, and eloquence. Our discussion will be moderated by Professor Ellen Davis. Ellen Davis has an official title. She is Amos Reagan Kern's Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School. What this does not tell you is that she is a gem, a gifted author, an award-winning teacher, a compelling moral voice, and the epitome of grace, someone I count myself blessed to have as friend and mentor. The author of 10 books and many articles, her research focuses on how biblical interpretation bears on the life of faith communities and their response to urgent public issues, particularly the environmental crisis and interfaith relations. Her recent book, Biblical Prophecy, Perspective for Christian Theology, Discipleship Ministry, explores the prophetic role and word across both testaments of the Christian Bible. Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible, integrates biblical studies with a critique of industrial agriculture and food production. Her most recent book is Preaching the Luminous Word, a collection of sermons and essays. A lay Episcopalian with a truly universal and encompassing soul and an intrepid, deeply curious mind, Professor Davis has been an active theological consultant within the Anglican Communion. Her work takes her frequently to Sudan as well as around the globe, but her work abroad continually enriches all that she does here in the community and the classroom. I could go on about the richness she and my other colleagues have brought to interreligious conversation on our campus, but suffice to say that I can think of no better interlocutor for tonight's rich discussion. Thank you all and welcome.
Thank you, Noah Pickus, Laura Lieber, and thank you especially Rabbi Sachs and Imam Antepli for being with us this evening. You are both faith leaders who are somewhat unusual in the priority that you give to interaction with persons of other faiths. Would you begin by speaking to us about how your view of that work and your involvement in it has changed over the years?
I will indeed, Ellen. Let me just, before I begin to answer, can I just add my own sense of thanks and privilege of being able to take part in this tribute to the memory of one of the great figures of American life, the late Morris Abraham, and to say how moving it is to pay tribute to his work and to meet the members of his family. That's just terrific. Second, what a gem you have in the Imam here. I mean, this is a one-man irresistible force for good who has shown that the love of God leads you to the love of human beings. And Imam, I had heard about you from many mutual friends of ours and the great blessings you've conferred on us all. So we salute you and may God bless you in all you do, and it's a privilege to be with you.
Thank you.
And finally, let me just add, for those who missed it, and I nearly missed it myself, as we were coming in, the church bells were ringing, and somebody noticed that as we were walking across the courtyard, they started playing a Jewish song, Avenu Shalom Aleichem, we welcome you. Now, Somebody asked me, is it still Jewish if it's played on church bells? To which my answer is, you don't ask a question like that in Duke. Here we got church bells playing a Jewish song, and here we are, an imam and a rabbi together. I expect the Messiah to come immediately, and we will not ask him or her whether he or she is Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. We will just celebrate being together. So thank you for an unprecedented and wonderful welcome. Now let me tell you why, as Chief Rabbi, interfaith work was so important to me. It seems to me that this is the very heart of the Abrahamic faiths. Human beings have always worshipped. They have always been in awe at the vastness of the universe and the smallness of us. But by and large, they worshipped the sun, the wind, the storm. They worshipped power. To some extent, human beings still worship power. Along came Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and put another concept at the heart of religion, namely love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And most important of all in the Hebrew Bible, it appears in some form or other 36 times, you shall love the stranger. Because it's easy to love your neighbor, especially if you live in a place like Durham, North Carolina. But it's the stranger, the person whose language and culture and maybe color is different from yours. That's hard to love, and that's why the Bible says, I made all human beings in my image, not necessarily in your image. And that's the challenge. And therefore, it seemed to me, in a world riven by conflict, if religious leaders could not show that love, we didn't deserve to be religious leaders. Now, there is a list, as you know, in the Bible of kosher and non-kosher animals. And one of the non-kosher animals is the stork. And a stork in Hebrew is called a chasidah. And the word chasidah comes from the Hebrew chesed, which means loving kindness. So people ask the obvious question, how come an animal whose name means loving kindness is not a kosher animal? To which the answer is, stork loves only its own. And unless your love extends beyond your own, that really isn't love. So I felt that we had to show this. So there is one of the most powerful signals we sent in Britain was that we were close as religious leaders. There are 9 major faith communities in Britain: Jews, Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, Jain, Zoroastrian, and Baha'i. They all were guests in our home. We did receptions to introduce the leaders of those various communities to one another. Rowan Williams, when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, and I took them all to Auschwitz together for a day, and that was a deeply bonding experience, tragically, realizing where hate could take us. And this had an impact. So we have just had a terrorist incident in Britain last Wednesday. You probably saw that in the papers. We had our own big terrorist incident on 7/7/2005, the 7th of July. There were suicide bombings in the subway and London buses. Within 24 hours, the Home Secretary had assembled all the faith leaders together because he was worried that more damaging than the casualties in the terrorist attack would be acts of violence between different religious groups, mainly in Midlands towns. As we sat it together around the table at the Home Office, I said, Home Secretary, what you don't understand is that all of us around this table are friends. And somehow that conveyed itself. I mean, we all stood together at Trafalgar Square, and we all spoke together and sang together. And that hit the news, and that photo opportunity actually told a message. So there was not a single attack on any Muslim, or there was no racial or ethnic incident after 7/7. And there wasn't, incidentally, after this recent attack. So when you work at good relations across faiths, it shapes and refines a national culture and creates a mood. And I think that becomes the single biggest imperative today in the 21st century, when we are all thrust so close to one another because the internet has abolished distance. It hasn't abolished difference, but it's abolished distance. So that's why we do it, and it's been terribly rewarding.
So you're suggesting that love and friendship actually filters out into your communities.
It filters out, and sometimes in very dramatic ways. For some reason, the BBC allowed me to do a television film every year, 30-minute television film, which was a message to the nation. Now, go figure on this one. Here's a rabbi talking to an audience, 99.5% of whom are not Jewish. I was wondering, where's a precedent for this? And I had to go back to the prophet Jonah, who appears to be the last one to go out and preach to the heathen, if you know what I mean. I had this incredible gift of primetime television for half an hour on BBC One. And on one occasion, for instance, you remember there was an American journalist called Daniel Pearl, who was murdered in 2002 in Karachi. Daniel's father, Judea, I was able to take Daniel's father, Judea, and Akbar Ahmed, who was then the Pakistani High Commissioner in Britain. And they became friends. And they were talking together in our home when we filmed that, and then I took them both into a Jewish school, and then I took them both into a Muslim school with the BBC cameras. And that was so powerful. Here was a father who just lost his son, looking at the camera with his friend, the Pakistani High Commissioner, who has been since then a friend of Elaine and myself, saying, "Hate killed my son. So I will spend the rest of my life fighting hate." A film that made an even bigger impact because it was so improbable is that there is an Orthodox Jewish day school, King David, in Birmingham, in which over 51% of the children are Muslim. This was a school under my aegis. It's a small Jewish community, so even if all the Jewish kids go to the school, it's still majority Muslim, plus a lot of Hindus and a lot of Sikhs. Birmingham is the area that has the worst interfaith relations in Britain, and this suicide killer of last week came from Birmingham, or was radicalized in Birmingham. So here's a school with young kids, mainly Muslim, and to have a Muslim parent say, "I specially moved into that part of Birmingham so that I could send my children to a Jewish school." Do you know what that conveyed on primetime television? And then I spent the day with the kids teaching them an Israeli peace song that they sang in Hebrew and Arabic and English.
Which one?
Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu.
Shalom
Aleinu. Od Yavo Shalom. We're going to dance to that. Come on, we're saving that till the end, and then we're going to get them all to sing it, okay? But, I mean, the number of people who wrote to me saying there were tears in our eyes when we were seeing it. The camera was panning across the faces of the children, and you could see which were the Jewish ones, which were the Muslim ones, and the Chinese ones, and the Sikhs, you know. So when you can deliver a message like that, very visual, it doesn't have to be terribly cerebral, it has to be visual. You say something, and the truth is, faith is one of those things that grows bigger by being shared. Imam.
Well, first of all, thank you and welcome. Welcome to Duke. Welcome to the land of Blue Devils.
Hey.
I hope your next academic appointment will be here, so we will enjoy your presence and your wisdom. Your kind words is a case study for humility, and beauty is in the eyes of beholder, proverb. I've been following your work, and when I grow up, I want to be like you.
Never grow up, first rule in life. Grow old, yes. Grow up, no.
No. We are, brothers and sisters in the audience, we are really in the presence of a very holy man. And I hope we can enjoy the presence as much as we can. Much like the current Pope Francis, I think your presence, your work, the reality that you create globally, transnationally, it captures the moral imagination of many of us, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and others, because your work is a proof of an impossible for a lot of us, that what you are proving what religion can become, what a religious person can become, what religion, when it works, when it's best, looks like. And you model this, I hope, as generation coming after you, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we are going to do a better job, at least sustaining that beauty and glory of God in your beautiful work. My attraction to interfaith was, like many of us, initially very utilitarian, very pragmatic. I was unstoppably, if that's a correct word, curious about anything and everything that's different. I have this innate curiosity about anything that's different than me in general. But when I became an imam, understanding Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism, it became an essential part of my work, intellectual and theological work, but also it became an essential responsibility for problem solving. So curiosity and problem solving was my major introduction to interfaith dialogue, to tame and stop and eliminate, hopefully, the religious intolerance in my community and try to explain Islam as religion and Muslims as people to non-Muslims. It became a major part of my work. More than I spend my time with the Muslim communities, I spend more time with the interfaith communities. I have a son. We had a couple of his classmates at our house for a sleepover on a Saturday night. And on Sunday morning, we were having breakfast. I said, in a rushing way, Friday night. On a Saturday morning, I had said, I'm rushing because I have to go to a synagogue to give a talk. And my son's friend said, I thought you guys were Muslims. And my son rolled over his eyes and said, my father goes to synagogue and churches more than many Christians and Jews we know. But as I made those intellectual, professional journeys into Judaism and Christianity in particular, that pragmatism and utilitarian agenda became so superficial to me. Interfaith, I mean, if it solves any problem, that's fine. As we Muslims say, it's dayenu. But I think there's something bigger and better and holier is available for us. As I learned more about Christianity, as I learned more about Judaism, as I shopped in the Jewish and Christian supermarkets and saw what's displayed in those shelves, it made me a better Muslim. I developed an incredibly sophisticated understanding of my own faith, which without that cross-faith, cross-religious conversation couldn't be possible. I think the success, that's my measure of success for interfaith dialogue. If it makes you more rooted, more confident, more attached to your own faith tradition, as you simultaneously develop an appreciation, knowledge, and holy envy towards other faith traditions. So it became from problem solving into defending your community to solving internal issues to swimming in the spiritual pleasures of oceans. That I experienced God's presence in my life. I experienced Shekinah, the kind of, in a rich way, in those rich cross-faith conversations, especially if it is done with people who are so confident and rooted in their own faith tradition. Sometimes it is more spiritually pleasurable, I would say, those cross-faith conversations, than I don't necessarily find that pleasure all the time in my own mosque setting or Muslim spaces. The last thing I will say, there are so many verses in the Holy Quran. God says, I created you different. Being the youngest sibling of the Abrahamic faith, I guess Muslims try to understand religious difference early on. And God goes out of its way, God of her way or his way. The English pronouns are very problematic. To assign gender to God is such a spiritually struggle for me. But God says, I created you different in many instances so that you will get to know one another, so that you will compete in doing God's work together. In the 21st century, where all religions are together, where global realities are pushing us, forcing us to be much closer proximity than ever before, those verses of the Quran means a lot more. I think cross-faith, interfaith is more than problem solving, more than defeating terrorism, more than, which is the noble noble goal, more than just ending hate. I think there is more to it that God, in many ways, we can sing some new songs to God jointly without compromising our particularisms, without compromising our faith traditions. One of my biggest fears, I don't know, I would love to hear from you, Rabbi. One of my biggest fears about interfaith dialogue, it will turn into a religion itself. It will undermine and disrespect the particularisms of these millennium-long wisdoms accumulated in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that we will all just be one. I think that's my biggest fear. I hope it will be just the opposite. We will do more meaningful, more rewarding, more nurturing interfaith conversations that it will only highlight those beautiful, unique, particular articulations of God's glory and grace in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and more.
Let me just add, if I may, just two little footnotes. Number one, your last point. It seems to me, and I've argued this in my book, Dignity of Difference, that the true beating heart of monotheism is not one God, one truth, one way, but that unity in heaven creates diversity down here on earth. And it is in our particularity that is born our universality. The reason we read the novels of Tolstoy is because he's so Russian. The reason we love the paintings of Monet is that because he's so French. The reason we love the serene beauty of a Zen garden is because it's so Japanese. So we're not all one big global franchise so that you can go all over the world and buy the same objects in the same supermarkets. What really speaks to all of us is what is unique in each of us. And that therefore means that if we truly engage in friendship and genuine love, love is inherently particular. Justice is inherently universal, but love is inherently particular. And therefore the distinctive gifts of Islam and Christianity and Judaism will not be diminished by that. The second thing is that what we are working toward, I have to say this because it's a story that not many people know, has already occurred. We're not creating something unprecedented. We are recovering a story that's almost unknown. And here is the story. The first person I can identify who made a religious case for freedom of speech was the great Islamic theologian Averroes. In the 12th century, he's the first person ever to say, if you're confident in your faith, you do not wish to silence your opponents, you wish them to speak as forcefully as possible because you know that you're going to win. That is then taken up 4 centuries later by one of my ancestors, somebody known as the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, who quotes it in the name of Averroes. 50 years later, it is taken up by the great Christian writer in England, John Milton, in his defense of free speech, Areopagitica. 2 centuries later, it is taken up by a secular humanist, John Stuart Mill, in his essay on liberty. So here is an argument for liberty and freedom of speech begun by a Muslim, adopted by a Jew, then by a Christian, then by a secular humanist. And people don't know this story. They think we're going to have to invent something new in the 21st century. It was actually Islam that showed the way, existentially, in that remarkable period known as Convivencia in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain, under the Umayyads. And it's there. And therefore, we don't need to ask, is it possible? It is possible because all those years ago it was actual. So I think this should give people grounded hope that what we are aspiring to can be done because it has been done.
Am I allowed to respond?
Yes. But may I ask a question also of both of you at this moment? You say we're not inventing something, but is there also something particular about this historical moment? Is it different because of Auschwitz, for instance? Is it, or other factors? So if you would bring that into the conversation.
Absolutely. My answer was going to be very relevant to your question as well. Quite honestly, Rabbi Sachs, I struggle with that we are not inventing anything question. And I arrived to a conclusion that some invention is needed, because what's out there in the tradition is partially helpful, and sometimes if it is not utilized well, it's like if you learn how to type with 2 fingers, your ability to type with 10 fingers become even more difficult. I agree that religious pluralism is not new. And I am confidently and proudly proclaim that Islam, in its own 1,400 years of history, has been in the forefront of recognizing the dignity of difference and understanding religious difference much more successfully. And Islam had many privileges because we came as the youngest sibling of Abrahamic family. And after 10 years of persecution, Muslims dealt with religious difference from a position of power and privilege. It's much easier to be charitable to people of other faith when you are a religion of an empire. And it's much more difficult. Therefore, I think religious minorities, relatively speaking, had much easier time in the Muslim world. Just compare the Jewish experience in the Muslim world and the Jewish experience elsewhere. It wasn't rosy, but relatively speaking, it's incredibly, incredibly generous, charitable, accommodating. But when I look to the past, what our tradition and our ancestors have given to us, they have given to us what worked in their time. It was an imperial peace. It was an imperial pluralism, that it was hierarchical. It was hierarchical, meaning whoever wins, whoever assumes the political power, they are in the business class, and everybody else, depending on their loyalty to the state and the status quo, they were in the economy class, they were in the closet, they were in wherever they travel. I think what is particular about our time is if you're going to take this pluralism very seriously, both theologically as well as socially and politically, time and the kind of voices of exclusion, people who unwelcome religious pluralism or ethnic racial pluralism, they are demanding us to figure this out in a new way, that those hierarchical system that ranked value of religions and religious dignity is no longer valid in the 21st century. That we have to find out a way how in the 21st century look for what's out there, but improve it. How can we come up with the Abrahamic pluralism 2.0 or 3.0, which would require not to see people in different ranks, but equal. If I may just end with a Hasidic joke. A Haredi was desperate.
No, I don't know any Muslim jokes. You're going to have to.
A Haredi was just came across in the middle of the night another disciple of the same rabbi. I don't know if you know this joke. I haven't heard from a lot of people. In the middle of the night, he was desperately looking for a key. And then, of course, as a generous human being, he started helping him, looking everywhere. And then they looked everywhere, but they couldn't find the key. And the guy who's trying to help asked, "Did you drop the key here? Are you sure?" He said, "No, I didn't drop it here." "Then why are you looking in this area?" He said, "This is the only place light is on. This is the only place there's light." So I think, in addition, this is not in disagreement with you. There are things where our tradition, our religion in the past shed light on. There are things that we need to learn and improve. But I think in the modern 21st century, religious, egalitarian, equal pluralism and equality requires us holding hands and walking towards those dark places who have yet to be lit, who have yet to be cleared out from the kind of darkness that they are in.
You are entirely correct. And the reason I said what I did is not that I think all the answers have been provided, but we do have precedent to build on. There is no doubt that to move to the kind of deep acceptance of the other from within a given monotheism to those outside it is going to need some dramatic reinterpretation of texts. When I stood with imams and with the Archbishop of Canterbury at Ground Zero, still smoking wreckage, I decided then and there that that had to be my personal task, primary task from then on. And I wrote a book called Dignity of Difference that was published on the first anniversary of 9/11. I was pretty nearly excommunicated for that, which, given that I am the guy who excommunicates, was fairly radical, actually. In fact, Rowan Williams had just been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and just a week before he'd attended a Druid service, which is heretical in Christian terms. So there was a headline in a newspaper of ours called The Guardian. For some reason, I never cut it out. I should have done. It said, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chief Rabbi accused of heresy. And I said to Rome, there can't have been many times that that headline has been used. So I had to take a lot of risks to write Dignity of Difference. And I knew then and there that that was the beginning, not the end. I took even more risks with Not in God's Name, which is a dramatic rereading of 4 or 5 key narratives in Genesis. I'm giving readings to those texts that have never been given before. And you have to have that courage. One of the things that empowered me was having looked very carefully at what the Catholic Church had done after the Holocaust, when a very great Pope, John the 23rd, set in motion Vatican II, which culminated in Nostra Aetate. He didn't live to see it. But that did indeed reinterpret Christian texts. I mean, giving primacy, as it were, to Romans 11 over and above other texts. Mm-hmm. And you will know that to reinterpret the Quran, you've got to do something very similar, like the quote that you just gave us about creating differences so that you may know one another. You have to reinterpret the texts. I was at the National Prayer Breakfast a couple of months ago, and I met a great imam whom I admit I'd never heard of before.
I wasn't there.
Another great imam, called, if I've got his name right, Sheikh Ben Baya.
Yes, Abdullah bin Baya.
Who had constructed and had joined with him 200 imams, the Marrakesh Declaration, which I think is quite a bold statement of the rights of minorities in Islamic countries, breaking away from that dhimmi concept of second-class citizenship. So you can point to examples, I think, in all three faiths, but it is a radical rereading of the text. And I believe, as a religious believer, that God wants us to hear within the Word of God for all time, the Word of God for this time. And that is clearly going to be radical and risky.
Absolutely.
Both of you have emphasized maintaining the particularity and integrity of your own traditions. Would you speak a little bit about the dynamics of interfaith dialogue or work, how that might differ between different pairs within the Abrahamic faiths? Is it different, for instance, with Muslims and Christians than with Muslims and Jews? And I think each of you work with a pair, with different pairs, and also across those three. Would you just talk about the complexities of those?
Absolutely. I am a big believer of bilateral relationships. It's not an either-or question. Of course, our call for inclusion, our call for interfaith conversations, it should be as widely welcoming and open as possible. As many faith traditions should be represented, as long as they are confident enough in the Avicenna's word to represent their faith tradition. But in addition to those, like big tent, interfaith conversations where everybody is welcome. I think there is tremendous amount of wisdom and tremendous amount of potential reward and at significant potential consequences if you don't do it. If you don't do bilateral, one-on-one conversations. As you know, I do a lot of Jewish-Muslim relations work, Jewish-Christian work, because I believe these faith traditions, their theologies, their emphasis, more importantly, their histories in the context of Jewish-Muslim relations, contradicting histories, contradicting memories, contradicting and the self-glorifying sources of information for a long time, has brought us to a place where those kind of difficult, complicated issues will not be addressed if there are 9 traditions we are talking about, we are all God's children, etc. That requires much long marathon sort of one-on-one conversations where we can go and address the ideological and theological roots of that problem and also social, political, and historical roots of the problem. If I may give a few examples between Jews and Muslims, it is, especially in the West, in Europe and the United States, it is no secret that we are not doing well. It is no secret that Jews and Muslims are as more, regretfully, our great report is not very impressive. We wouldn't get C-. Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, they are not locking arms and singing Hina Matovu Manayim, Shevet Achim Gam. And neither in Europe, I don't see that they are singing Oze Shalom Bimrumov. Here in America, we have a relatively better situation. But I hope we will seize the moment of the situation. But even in the United States, where Jewish-Muslim relations are relatively better, Jews and Muslims only get together and get along if you don't speak about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if they don't speak about politics, if they only come together and eat hummus and talk about halal chicken, kosher chicken, which I am so tired of. There is so much more we can do. And it's so regrettable, to me pathological. It's pathetic that Jews and Muslims in America can't go beyond these superficial kumbaya singing sessions, as often they are criticized, and can address the real root causes, major problems that dividing, polarizing Jews and Muslims. Same thing with the Islam and Christianity. And one of the ways in which we shouldn't do these bilateral relationships is, one of the funniest words and most troubling words that I heard after coming to the United States 15 years ago, I heard somebody in a lecture was mentioning Judeo-Christian civilization. I thought Jon Stewart was making fun of somebody. Like I thought it was a joke, Judeo-Christian civilization. First time I heard. I said, did anybody study Jewish-Christian relationship in the last 2,000 years? Like, you would be ashamed to say Judeo-Christian civilization in that sense. If it is done in the context of forget about our history and our real issues, we will just present a block against keeping Islam as a stepchild in the family, then it's harmful. But if it is about we have particular challenges and opportunities, let's sit down and talk. I think it should be welcome, encouraged, and supported.
Historically, the bilateral relations have been very different for one curious reason, which is that although Jewish-Muslim relations, while not great, were nonetheless, over historical span, much better than Jewish-Christian relations. There was always much more Jewish-Christian dialogue, not in the modern sense. It used to be called disputations. And Jews didn't know. I mean, the most famous was the one in Barcelona in 1263. Mm-hmm. And Jews did not know whether it was better to win or to lose. It was very uncomfortable. But that in that sense, there was much more talking between Jews and Christians than between Jews and Muslims. But the theological differences between Jews and Christians are much greater than between Jews and Muslims, who share a very austere, aniconic monotheism and a very similar approach to law, halakha, sharia. And the reason that there was not much Jewish-Muslim conversation, but there was a great deal of Jewish-Christian one, is that Jews and Christians shared a text, what we call Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, whereas Jews and Muslims didn't share a text, so they never had something to study together. So the truth is that those relationships have played out differently over time. And they are still painful. There's no question. They are still really painful because those texts are minefields. You know, however much you try to look at the nice texts, there are hard texts all over the place, and they occupy a very potent place in the minds of many believers. So these are difficult things. And I, therefore, some years ago, seeing some of the limits of text-based dialogue. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to do, but it's often done by very gifted people with a great deal of theological self-confidence. And interfaith violence takes place on the streets of Birmingham, not, you know, in the beautiful campuses of Oxford or Cambridge.
The Chavruta sessions.
In Chavruta, exactly. So, you know, in the end, I chose to be guided by a different philosophy. And I wrote a sort of little book about this called The Home We Build Together. And I spoke about face-to-face and side-by-side. Face-to-face is interfaith dialogue. It's an elite activity, whereas side-by-side is different. So let me give you an example of side-by-side. Side-by-side, Jews in America, and we took it to England, have something called Mitzvah Day, which is a day, one day of the year when we ask all the members of our community to go and do an act of kindness to somebody who's not a member of their community, to reach outside the faith. The Hindus in Britain heard about Mitzvah Day, and they said, could we have a Mitzvah Day? So as we said, Gesundheit, hey, please feel free. So they did Siwa Day. The next year they said, could we do Siwa Day and Mitzvah Day on the same day? So it became Jews and Hindus doing mitzvahs together. Then the Muslims heard, and they joined in, and then the Christian churches...
They are always late, Muslims.
Then the churches join in, and then everyone was joining in. So we were all, you know, Muslim, and, you know, me and my, you know, painting walls of hospices or building bird boxes for park. We were all, you know, we were all doing this together, side by side. Now, the beauty of side by side is it involves no theology, it's street level, and what it does, it doesn't produce agreement, what it produces is friendship. And when you have friendship, you discover that the people not like us are people like us. And when that happens, a conversation can begin. Not easy, but when it is there, rooted in an existing friendship, it becomes real and it becomes strong. So although I acknowledge that this is a spiky sort of territory, which, you know, is difficult, there are other ways. When you get held up here, you know, I always chose to find another way, and we've moved on through that side by side, even though the face-to-face sometimes between Jews and Muslims in Europe is not great.
I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about the face-to-face. But before that, I'm curious about the approach that you've taken in your book, Not in God's Name, in which you're doing serious, as you've just said, biblical interpretation through very much, if not most, of that book. Who do you imagine to be your audience? Who do you think will slow down for that?
I wanted to write a book that was first of all, I wanted to do two things in that book. Number one, I wanted to make a religious protest against religious violence. I mean, you know, my dearly beloved friend, Richard Dawkins, with whom we agree to disagree on many things, we know that Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens have made secular critiques of violence in the name of God. you know, you don't need another one of those, although I could have written it. I do write secular books. I felt it was important for a religious voice to enter. Now, it was absolutely clear that I couldn't say anything about Christianity or about Islam. That had to be done by Christian thinkers and Muslim thinkers. So what I was trying to do was to show Christians and Muslims that a Jew can do this. It's a very self-critical text. We know that a lot of the Jewish Christian bad blood happened because of something known as supersessionist theology. Now, a Jew cannot write about Christian supersessionist theology. So I was asking myself, and I began that book in 2003. I didn't finish it until 2015. It took me, I wrote it 4 times. But I was trying to say, where can I find supersessionist theology in Judaism? I find it very easily vis-a-vis Canaanites, Jebusites, and Perizzites, but there are not a lot of, you know, activists on behalf of the Jebusites these days, you know, so that didn't speak to people. So, and I thought about this for years, and I suddenly realized that all those sibling rivalry narratives in Genesis are actually all supersession narratives, because it's always the younger who's taking the place of the older. And I said, this is it. If I can do an internal critique of those narratives and get us to see them a completely different way, then I will have done this self-critical reconstructive theology within Judaism. And I would hope this is a book that Christians and Muslims could read and find empowering. Because I've read enough books by Jews on anti-Semitism, written by Jews, read by Jews. You know, we do not move the world forward by complaining to our fellow faith members about the way the world is treating us. That's too easy. It leads to self-pity and further estrangement. So I thought, can I write a book that can be read by Muslims and Christians? So I had a friend called Ed Hussein who read this as a Muslim. I have a friend up in St. Andrews, previously the Bishop of Durham, Tom Wright, who's the world's greatest Pauline scholar, who, you know, and of course I rewrote the book in the light of those, but I wrote it to be read by Christian and Muslim thinkers. And the most enthusiastic readers have been Christian and Muslim. I don't know whether Jews like it very much, probably not. But you know, I mean, look, you know, Irshad Manji, who is not the world's most typical Muslim, but wrote a lovely review in the New York Times, and various Christians did likewise. And
I have a slightly mischievous theory why Christians and Muslims like the book more. I think you are modeling one of the best outcomes of interfaith dialogue. If interfaith dialogue works, you can subcontract certain theological work to other faith traditions that you can't do. Like, only a faithful Jew can write such a book and wrestle with God. As a Muslim, I can't use that kind of language. I can't go there. I can't. Like, there is nothing in my religious DNA where I can make those moves. It'll undermine my very understanding of God, which I'm not willing to do. But I develop a love relationship with someone who I believe is a person of God. In his authentic Judaism and Jewishness, he can do that work for us. And we can just look from his shoulders and benefit. And
God chose Muslims because he wanted somebody to obey him. God chose Jews because he wanted somebody to argue with him.
Christians?
And Christians because they ring more beautiful bells than anyone else. Christians because, you know, we only touched a few souls and you touched many. But Christianity touched more souls than any other movement in the whole of human civilization. And they did so by speaking to the poor. They did so by speaking to the rejected. So, you know, I'm so thankful for what Christianity brought to the world. I am so thankful for what Islam brought to the world. There's absolutely no doubt, if you want modeled what it is to have undiminished faith in the face of a secular and secularizing culture, you have to go and sit with Muslims. You know, I'm sitting with a group of Muslims, they will look at their watch and they say, please forgive us, we've got to go and pray. They go and pray for 5 minutes, they come back. You know, I keep saying, could you please teach our lot to do that? You know. So each of the faiths has a magnificent achievement or set of achievements to thank God for and that the world has to thank them for. So,
as you know, I take a group of Muslim leaders to Jerusalem at Shalom Hartman campus. And it's a campus where in the summer, Rabbi Sager and Rabbi Graber also were there. It's busy with a lot of religious Jews and religious Muslims. But Muslims are in the forefront. Just keep praying all the time, like 5 times a day. And that creates a beautiful scene and a kind of self-reflection on that campus about what about my prayer life.
yeah, and you know what we do, it's the only thing that works. It's a famous story. You've told us stories, so let me tell a story. A rabbi and an Israeli taxi driver leave this world at the same time and arrive at the gates of heaven. And the angel looks at the rabbi and says, sorry. And he looks at the Israeli taxi driver and says, up you go. And the rabbi says, what? I spent my whole life teaching God's word. And this taxi driver spent his whole life driving like a lunatic. Exactly so, said the angel. When you spoke, they slept. But when he drove, they prayed.
Whatever works.
Rabbi Sachs, I want to go back to your statement that the side-by-side builds friendship and the face-to-face is an elite activity. But as someone who teaches people who are going to be leading congregations, I'm seeing in the last maybe 8 or 10 years what you might say is a less elite interest in the interfaith conversation. Increasingly, my students ask me, and I think ask Imam Antepli, show us how to do this. How do we get started with this? So I'd like to ask both of you to reflect upon, and maybe reflect upon some of the theological sticking points or the theological avenues that you see open for these kinds of conversations. Where would the ordinary congregation, where might they begin?
Well, look, when I began, you know, my rabbis and I was head of the rabbinical, my dayanim were happy for me to do this, but they didn't really see it related to them. And then, of course, I began to realize how important it was. So we began to teach all our congregational rabbis. And they began to do it. And Imam, as you said, they began to love it. Because they began to have serious theological conversations that they couldn't always have with members of their congregation. They began to love it, and they began to do it very well. And then, since I was very much involved in the Conference of European Rabbis, we worked right across Europe. And again, you know, the mainland European rabbinate looked at us as very strange, because the Orthodox rabbinate was not a leader in this field. And after a couple of years, they asked us to put on a seminar for the whole Orthodox rabbinate in Europe. So it spread and spread and spread and become very, very, very much something that everyone engages in. And they feel it's incredibly valuable. Now, I haven't done something with an imam in a synagogue, but 3 weeks ago, we had the number 2 in the Anglican community, and the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, who's an old friend, spend the whole of Shabbat with us, from Kabbalat Shabbat to Havdalah. That's 25 hours. This would, I suspect this has never happened before. And I said, John, why do you want to do it? And a very interesting answer. He said, one of the greatest gifts you gave us was the Sabbath. and we have lost it, and you have kept it. And I want to come and see how you keep it. How did you keep it? And the number of people who came to synagogue just to converse with this man. I don't mean actually during prayer, although they say the art of conversation is dead. No, it's alive and well and happens in the middle of prayers in synagogue. But you know, just to see people, the turnout for what was, you know, in Anglo-Jewish Orthodox terms, quite unusual, a rabbi and an archbishop talking together in the synagogue. This was terrific, and you know, I'd love to do it with an imam. So
I sign up.
yeah,
I sign up. I think, thank you for bringing such a positive note. I don't want to be a rein into our party, but I think also the recent shift and changes of a lot of faith communities taking interfaith a lot more seriously is also coming from a place of panic, because things are not getting better. Because voices of exclusion outside of our faith community, also within our community, is showing its ugly faces, that people say, we have to do something about this. Like I've been receiving a number of phone calls from our students. I'm a Methodist minister in Trinity, North Carolina. I can't believe what my congregants are saying about Islam and Muslims. Can you come and talk to us? Or imams calling me from all over the country. You seem to know something about Jews and Judaism. Can you come and run a two-week series about Judaism and Jews? Because I can't believe things that I'm hearing in my own community. Or there is a mosque and synagogue down the street. We don't know how to engage. We don't know how to even begin. And even if we begin, we don't know how to go beyond the first or second conversation. Like we get together, ate hummus, what's next? A lot of guidance is required and needed. And I think we have a moral responsibility as faith leaders to model and exemplify what would that meaningful conversations would look like.
I agree with you, but at the same time, you know, I began all of this back in 2002, 2003, when I began to notice that fear after 9/11 was turning all faith communities inward. And I said, when you see faith communities turning inward, you have to get up and turn them outward. That's when I wrote my book, To Heal a Fractured World, which was sort of bringing back the universalism into Judaism and so on. We must not be driven by panic, and it becomes terribly, terribly important to give the notes of confidence to people. I was once asked, how would I sum up Judaism in one sentence? And I said, Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of humankind. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and we're still here, and we're still singing. So I think somehow or other, I see religious leaders as agents of hope, because the worst politics are the politics of fear. And when fear takes hold, and you know fear is much more powerful than any positive emotion because it activates the amygdala, which is so much more powerful than the limbic system, which is more powerful than the prefrontal cortex. And when we're afraid, we do crazy and destructive things. So, you know, I spend my life fighting fear and telling people we can win this, just relax. Jews, as you probably know, feel very threatened on university campuses throughout the world. We've just had something called Israel Apartheid Week, and I'm not going to go into that, but this is scary. You know, for my children and to experience anti-Semitism on campus, which my youngest child did do and which I never did in my whole life. This is scary stuff. So there's a lot of giving assurance and hope. This is not closing your eyes to the bad stuff, but it is saying we have to be agents of hope.
I can't agree more. And I think it's Rabbi Nachman who said there is no greater sin other than the hopelessness. Yeah. One of the grave consequences of fear, it pushes people to hopelessness and despair. And in Islam, hopelessness and not believing in God is considered as equal. Because if you believe in a higher authority, you can never be hopeless. Yeah. Absolutely.
No one wants to end this conversation, but I know that there are a lot of people who would like to join the conversation. And we perhaps have time for a couple of questions. Noah Pickus, will you lead us in that?
We have very little time. The rabbi is on a tight schedule. The good news is that you can come back tomorrow night at 5:30 at the Sanford School of Public Policy for the rabbi's talk based on his recent book, Not in God's Name, on confronting religious violence. We have two gems here in our community, Imam Antepli and Professor Davis, who will stay with us happily for many years to come. And we have Rabbi Sachs, who is visiting again, and we're so grateful to you for coming and for being part of this conversation. And we will see all of you tomorrow night, I hope, at 5:30 at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Thank you.